June 13th, 1942. The Atlantic Ocean is black and silent beneath a blanket of fog. A lone Coast Guard seaman walks his midnight patrol along the dunes of Amagansett, Long Island, flashlight in one hand, flare gun in the other. His name is John Cullen, 21 years old, fresh from training, and utterly unaware that history is about to find him. Out of the haze, shadows begin to form. 4 men, their outlines glistening with seawater. They claim to be local fishermen whose boat has run aground, but their clothes don't match their story. One of them, tall and sharp-eyed, steps forward. His name, though Cullen doesn't yet know it, is George John Dash, leader of a secret Nazi team sent by submarine across the Atlantic. Cullen asks for identification. The stranger hesitates, then lowers his voice. "You don't know what this is all about," he says. "I wouldn't want to kill you." A pause. Then Dash reaches into his pocket and pulls out a wad of damp American bills. $300, more than a month's pay for the young guardsman. "Take it. Forget you ever saw us." Cullen pretends to accept. He backs away slowly, nodding, heart pounding. The men disappear into the dunes. Moments later, Cullen bursts through the door of the Amagansett Coast Guard station. He gasps only 4 words. "There are Germans on the beach." By dawn, the fog has lifted. Buried in the sand, investigators uncover wooden crates packed with explosives, detonators, and German Navy uniforms. Out at sea, a grey U-boat slips beneath the waves, vanishing back toward Europe. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign soldiers had touched American soil and shattered its illusion of safety. Their mission, ordered by Adolf Hitler himself, is to cripple America's war industry and sow terror across the nation. 8 men, trained by the Abwehr, armed with dynamite and cash, now vanish into the heart of the United States. What none of them realize is that within weeks their mission will collapse, not from the guns of the FBI, but from betrayal within their own ranks. This is the story of Operation Pastorius, Hitler's failed invasion of America. In the winter of 1941, as Europe burned under the thunder of war, Adolf Hitler turned his gaze westward, across the Atlantic. America had entered the conflict after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and in the Führer's mind, the time had come to strike back, not on the battlefields of Africa or in the skies over Europe, but on American soil itself. He wanted panic. He wanted fear. He wanted the American people to know that even across an ocean, they were not beyond his reach. To make this vision real, Hitler called upon one of his most trusted intelligence officers, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the German military intelligence agency, the Abwehr. Canaris had a history of daring covert operations. During the First World War, he had sent agents into Morocco to blow up French installations and had organized sabotage missions in New York Harbor. Now, he was tasked with bringing the war back to America. From his headquarters in Berlin, Canaris summoned a man named Walter Kapper, a lieutenant in the German army who had once lived in the United States. Kapper knew America well, its optimism, its complacency, and its blind faith that the war was an ocean away. He understood its cities, its culture, its vast industries, and its weak points. His mission: recruit men who could blend in, men who spoke English like natives, men who knew how America worked. The plan was codenamed Operation Pastorius, after Francis Daniel Pastorius, the German settler who founded Germantown, Pennsylvania, in 1683, the first permanent German community in the New World. The symbolism was clear. Germans had once helped build America. Now they would return to destroy it. 8 men were chosen. 2 of them, Ernest Peter Berger and Herbert Hans Haupt, were American citizens. The others, George John Dash, Edward John Curling, Richard Quirin, Heinrich Heinck, Hermann Neubauer, and Werner Thiel had all spent years working in the United States. They were factory hands, machinists, cooks, waiters, ordinary men on the surface, but each had a different reason for joining the mission. Some believed in Hitler's promise of German victory. Others sought revenge, or simply a chance for adventure. At a secluded training camp on the shores of Lake Quenz near Berlin, the men were remade into saboteurs. For 3 weeks, instructors from the Abwehr drilled them in the art of destruction, how to wire dynamite, build detonators, and time an explosion with chemical fuses. They studied American newspapers, practiced English slang, memorized cover stories, and were told to live, eat, and think like Americans. Their targets were chosen with precision: the hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls, the aluminum factories of Tennessee, Illinois, and New York, locks on the Ohio River near Louisville, the vital Horseshoe Curve Rail pass in Pennsylvania, the Penn Salt chemical plant outside Philadelphia, where the rare element cryolite, essential for making aircraft aluminum, was being produced. They were also ordered to plant bombs in crowded public places, railway stations, bridges, water systems, even Jewish-owned stores, to spread chaos and terror among civilians. Each man was issued false identity papers, counterfeit social security cards, driver's licenses, and a total of $175,000, enough to live comfortably, move freely, and bribe anyone who stood in their way. But even before the mission began, cracks appeared. Dash, the oldest and most experienced of the group, accidentally left sensitive documents on a train. Another member, drunk in a Paris bar, boasted loudly that he was a German secret agent. The Abwehr's confidence faltered, but the plan moved forward. 2 submarines, U-202 and U-584, were prepared to cross the Atlantic. Each would carry 4 men. Their orders: land by night on America's east coast, disappear into the population, and begin the greatest sabotage campaign the United States had ever faced. They believed they were about to change the course of the war. In truth, they were sailing straight into disaster. The men arrived at Quenz Lake under heavy secrecy. The lake was still. Pine trees lined its banks. Only the faint sound of boots on gravel broke the calm. To the locals, the quiet estate near Brandenburg looked like any other lakeside retreat, a manor house surrounded by pine forests with a few outbuildings and a small pier. But behind its closed gates, the Abwehr had built a factory of spies. Here, in the spring of 1942, 8 men began their transformation from wanderers and labourers into Hitler's saboteurs. Their days followed a strict rhythm. At dawn, physical drills, boxing, running, and jiu-jitsu. After breakfast, long hours in makeshift classrooms learning the science of destruction. They memorized the wiring of explosives, the behavior of acids, and the delicate chemistry of delayed fuses. They learned to make detonators from household items, sugar cubes, peas, even shaving cream tins. Every lesson had one purpose: to teach them how to turn ordinary objects into weapons. George Dash, the leader, stood apart from the rest. In his late 30s, calm and thoughtful, he'd already lived a dozen lives. He'd once been a stowaway to America, worked as a waiter in New York, and even served briefly in the US Army. To him, this mission was a test, but not of loyalty to Hitler. Dash distrusted the Nazi regime deeply. He had seen its corruption and brutality. Yet to survive in Germany, he played along. Ernest Berger, another of the chosen 8, shared that quiet doubt. Once a loyal Nazi and a member of the stormtroopers, he'd been imprisoned in a concentration camp after criticizing the Gestapo. Now, out of work and under watch, he accepted recruitment into the operation as a way to prove his usefulness, or perhaps to escape the regime that had betrayed him. Others felt differently. Edward Curling, who would lead the second team, was a true believer, a proud party member who'd lived in Florida and dreamed of returning to America as Hitler's instrument. Heinrich Heinck and Richard Quirin were machinists who had worked in the US during the Depression, now hardened by the war and eager for recognition. Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer and Herbert Haupt were younger, restless, drawn by a mix of patriotism and recklessness. Haupt was just 22, an American citizen by birth who had lived in Chicago before returning to Germany. His parents had no idea their son was about to come back to the United States wearing the invisible uniform of the enemy. The men practiced their roles as Americans. They spoke only English at the dinner table, reading from Time and Life magazines provided by their instructors. They adopted new names, Paul, Jack, and Harry, and built entire lives from thin air, fake addresses, old jobs, school memories that never happened. The goal was to vanish into the crowd once they arrived in the US. During evenings by the lake, the mood shifted between excitement and fear. Some talked about the mission's glory, how they would strike a blow that would make Hitler proud. Others whispered about what would happen if they were caught. They all knew the rule. If captured in uniform, they'd be prisoners of war. If captured in civilian clothes, they'd be spies. And spies were executed. Before departure, Walter Kapper, their Abwehr overseer, gathered them in the Manor's hall. He looked over the 8 men, all dressed in civilian suits now, each carrying a small bag of personal belongings, and told them, "In America, you are ghosts. You will have no homeland, no name, no uniform, only your mission." On a May morning in 1942, the men were driven to the French coast under armed guard. The smell of diesel oil and salt filled the air as they boarded their U-boats, U-202 for Dash's Long Island team, and U-584 for Curling's Florida group. Each submarine was loaded with waterproof crates filled with dynamite, fuses, timers, and stacks of American cash, enough to sustain the teams for 2 years of sabotage. They vanished beneath the waves, believing they carried the future of the Reich with them. The Atlantic was merciless that June. The 2 U-boats crept across the ocean's surface like predators, silent, grey, and cold. Inside, the 8 men endured cramped quarters and the stench of diesel fuel. They were forbidden to smoke, forbidden to speak loudly, forbidden even to hope for rest. Every sound mattered. Above them, Allied patrols roamed the skies. 1 depth charge, 1 sonar ping, and the mission would die before it began. After nearly 3 weeks submerged, U-202 reached the coast of Long Island. It was just past midnight on June 13th, 1942. The captain, Hans-Heinz Lindner, ordered the vessel to surface near the village of Amagansett. A thick fog rolled over the beach, and the tide was low. The grey submarine eased upward, its tower barely visible in the darkness. The saboteurs climbed out of the hatch one by one, their faces pale from weeks below deck. Dash, Berger, Quirin, and Heinck, the Long Island team. Each man carried a waterproof crate packed with explosives, detonators, and $80,000 in American cash. Their orders were simple: bury the supplies, change into civilian clothes, and disappear into the city. But the sea was not kind. As they rowed their rubber dinghy toward shore, a wave caught them broadside, nearly capsizing the craft. The men scrambled through the surf, soaked and breathless, dragging their heavy crates across the sand. And then, as if fate itself were watching, a beam of light cut through the fog. A young Coast Guardsman, John Cullen, was on patrol. The encounter that followed, tense, awkward, terrifying, would doom the entire operation. Dash bribed him with $300 and a threat, hoping to buy silence. Instead, Cullen ran for help. By the time the Coast Guard returned, the Germans were gone. All they found were hastily buried uniforms, shovels, and wooden boxes stamped Deutsche Kriegsmarine. The U-202, stranded on a sandbank only a few hundred meters offshore, managed to free itself moments before sunrise. As it slipped beneath the waves, the saboteurs were already on the Long Island Railroad, headed for Manhattan. 4 days later, another submarine broke the surface, this time off Florida's Ponte Vedra beach. The 4 men aboard, Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer and Herbert Haupt, came ashore dressed in swimming trunks and German Navy caps. Once on land, they buried their supplies, changed into civilian clothes and split into pairs. Their destinations, Chicago, Cincinnati and New York. Both groups were to meet on July 4th in Cincinnati to coordinate their sabotage campaign. Their targets were ambitious: factories, power plants, bridges, railroads. They planned to strike quietly, methodically, using time-delayed fuses and small bombs that would cripple production and sow chaos. For now, though, they blended in. The Long Island men checked into a Manhattan hotel under false names, spending freely in bars and restaurants. The Florida team boarded trains northward, moving easily through crowds. No one looked twice at them, but something was wrong. The close call on the beach had shaken Dash deeply. The young Coast Guardsman's face haunted him. He knew the Americans would find the evidence and connect the dots. Every newspaper headline, every radio broadcast about coastal patrols felt like a tightening noose. As the days passed, paranoia turned to conviction. Dash no longer believed in the mission. He no longer believed in Hitler. He told Berger that continuing meant death, not only for them, but for countless innocents. George John Dash sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring out the window at the noise and light of New York City. It had been nearly a week since the landing. The others were scattered, some in Florida, some already on trains to Chicago. But the weight of their secret was unbearable. He turned to Ernest Berger, the man he trusted most among the team. Berger stood near the door, tense, waiting. Dash said quietly, "I can't do it." "I won't do it." Berger frowned. "What do you mean?" Dash motioned toward the window. "If we disagree, one of us will walk out that door. The other will fly out this window." Then, after a long silence, he confessed everything. He hated Nazism. He despised the Gestapo and the war. He had no intention of blowing up factories or bridges. He wanted to stop the operation by turning himself in. Berger, who had once been imprisoned by the Nazi regime for criticizing its brutality, listened without a word. When Dash finished, he nodded. "Then we go together." On June 15th, Dash took the first step, using the alias Franz Pastorius, a mocking reference to the operation's codename. He phoned the FBI office in New York. "I have come from Germany," he said. "I have important information for your government." The agent on the other end thought he was a crank and hung up. Undeterred, Dash packed a small suitcase, stuffed it with cash and documents, and bought a ticket to Washington, D.C. When he arrived, he walked straight into FBI headquarters and asked to speak with Director J. Edgar Hoover. The receptionist laughed. Instead, Dash was sent to Assistant Director D.M. Ladd. Ladd listened politely as the foreign man spoke about submarines, explosives, and Hitler's plan to destroy America's industries. Then Dash opened his suitcase and turned it upside down. $84,000 spilled across the desk. The room fell silent. That got their attention. Within hours, FBI agents began taking statements. Dash gave them everything: names, aliases, meeting points, codes, and locations of the buried equipment. He dictated for days, filling hundreds of pages. He was cooperative, calm, and precise. He even predicted where and when the other agents would meet. By the end of June, the FBI had captured all 8 men. The Long Island group was arrested first in New York. The Florida team was found in Chicago. Not a single shot was fired. Dash believed he would be treated as a hero, the man who single-handedly dismantled Hitler's spy network before a single bomb could detonate. But that wasn't how Washington saw it. J. Edgar Hoover saw an opportunity. In the anxious months after Pearl Harbor, America was desperate for reassurance, proof that its defenses were strong and its intelligence services effective. The public wanted victories, not complexities. So Hoover took credit. He announced that the FBI had cracked a Nazi sabotage ring through brilliant detective work. He never mentioned Dash's confession. He never spoke Berger's name. The newspapers hailed Hoover as the man who stopped Hitler's invasion of America. Headlines celebrated the FBI's swift and skillful action. Across the country, citizens felt a surge of pride. The truth that the entire operation had collapsed because one saboteur had defected was buried. For Dash and Berger, the victory they had handed to the United States came with a price. They were arrested and held under guard, accused of espionage alongside the men they had betrayed. Dash tried to explain. He wrote letters to Hoover, to President Roosevelt, to anyone who would listen. He insisted that he had come forward not out of fear, but conscience. But in wartime America, no one wanted to hear about the conscience of a Nazi. Within weeks, the stage was set for one of the most extraordinary trials in US history, one that would decide not only the fate of 8 men, but the legal boundaries of war itself. The summer of 1942 was heavy with fear. America had been at war for only 6 months, and the nation's confidence was still fragile. Rumors of Nazi spies and saboteurs spread like wildfire. Across the East Coast, blackout curtains hung in windows, and coastal patrols combed the beaches with rifles and dogs. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt demanded swift justice. When his advisors suggested trying the captured saboteurs in a civilian court, Roosevelt refused. "They came to destroy this country," he said. "They will be tried as enemies of the United States, not as citizens." The President issued Executive Proclamation 2561, creating a secret military tribunal to handle the case. It was the first of its kind since the Civil War. The order stated that anyone who entered the United States for the purpose of sabotage, espionage, or hostile acts would not have access to civilian courts or appeals. Roosevelt made one thing unmistakably clear to Attorney General Francis Biddle. "I want one thing clearly understood. I will not hand them over to any United States Marshal armed with a writ of habeas corpus. The trial would be held behind locked doors." On July 8, 1942, the 8 men, Dash, Berger, Curling, Haupt, Heinck, Neubauer, Thiel, and Quirin, were brought to a heavily guarded room inside the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. The chamber was small, sealed from the press and the public. A row of 7 high-ranking army officers, all generals, sat at the front. Their uniforms gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. At the center sat Major General Frank McCoy, president of the tribunal. Beside him, 6 other generals, including Walter Grant, Guy Henry Jr., and Blanton Winship. On the prosecution side, Attorney General Francis Biddle. The defense was led by 2 Army lawyers, Kenneth Royal and Lawson Stone, the son of the Chief Justice of the United States. The charges were grave: violating the law of war, spying for the enemy, conspiracy to commit sabotage against the United States. Each count carried the death penalty. The defendant sat silently in the dock. Each wore a simple suit, each with a number pinned to his lapel. Dash looked calm, detached. Berger appeared resigned. The others glared ahead, faces blank, as if waiting for a verdict they already knew. The defense tried desperately to argue that the men should be tried in civilian courts, since 2 of them, Berger and Haupt, were American citizens. Their appeal reached the Supreme Court in record time. The case would be remembered as ex parte quirin, a decision that defined the legal concept of the unlawful combatant. The court ruled unanimously that the president had acted within his wartime powers. The military tribunal would proceed. Inside the courtroom, witnesses described the landings, the crates of explosives, and the U-boats that vanished back into the Atlantic. FBI agents recounted the confessions Dash had given in exhaustive detail, though no mention was made of his voluntary surrender. Every piece of evidence painted the men as ruthless invaders. The trial lasted just 3 weeks. On August 1st, the tribunal delivered its verdict. All 8 were guilty. Roosevelt immediately reviewed the recommendations. Then, with a pen stroke, he commuted Dash's sentence to 30 years in prison and Berger's to life, acknowledging in secret the role they had played in exposing the plot. For the remaining 6, he ordered execution. At dawn on August 8, 1942, inside the District of Columbia jail, the condemned men were led one by one into the small chamber where the electric chair awaited. There were no cameras, no public witnesses, only soldiers, priests, and the hum of the current. Heinrich Heinck was first, followed by Richard Quirin, Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt. By mid-morning, all 6 were dead. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the Blue Plains Potter's Field, a quiet patch of ground on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Their graves were marked only with wooden boards bearing numbers instead of names. News of the executions broke that evening. Across America, relief mixed with unease. The public cheered the swift justice, but few understood how close the nation had come to chaos, or how the Federal Bureau of Investigation's triumph had depended on a man it now called a traitor. For George Dash and Ernest Berger, the story was far from over. Their lives would continue behind prison walls, haunted by the decision that had saved a country, but destroyed their own. The executions were over, but their echoes carried far beyond the walls of the D.C. jail. The 6 dead men became ghosts, forgotten by most Americans, disowned by the country that had sent them, and buried beneath simple numbered boards in the Blue Plains Potter's Field. The operation that was supposed to bring fire and fear to American soil had ended in silence. No factories were destroyed, no bridges bombed, no civilians harmed. The only casualties were the saboteurs themselves, victims of a plan doomed by arrogance, incompetence, and the human conscience of one man. When news of the fiasco reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler was furious. He raged that his agents had failed before even striking a single blow. He turned his anger on Admiral Canaris, accusing him of weakness and treachery. "Why didn't you send Jews?" he shouted, disgusted that Germans had once again shown mercy to the enemy. It was the beginning of the end for Canaris. His Abwehr was soon stripped of power, its authority consumed by Himmler's SS intelligence arm. By 1944, Canaris himself would be executed for treason, strangled with piano wire for plotting against Hitler. After Operation Pastorius, Nazi Germany never again attempted a major sabotage mission on American soil. There would be one smaller attempt, Operation Elster in 1944, when 2 SS agents were landed by submarine off the coast of Maine to spy on US industries. Within weeks, they too were captured after one turned himself in. The Nazis had learned nothing. In the United States, the case had far-reaching consequences. The Supreme Court decision in Ex parte Quirin created a precedent that would shape American law for generations, defining unlawful combatants and granting presidents wartime authority to try such enemies before military tribunals. It would be cited again decades later in wars far from the beaches of Long Island. For J. Edgar Hoover, the episode was a public relations triumph. He emerged as a national hero, hailed for protecting the homeland. The newspapers, fed by FBI press releases, told a simple story. The Bureau had foiled a Nazi plot through skill and vigilance. There was no mention of George Dash's confession, no hint that the case had been handed to the Bureau on a silver platter. Hoover's legend grew, and so did his control over America's secret world. Meanwhile, George Dash and Ernest Berger sat in their prison cells, forgotten. They had saved lives, perhaps even cities, but their names were cursed. To Americans, they were spies. To Germans, traitors. In April 1948, President Harry Truman quietly signed an order granting both men clemency, on one condition: they would be deported immediately and could never return to the United States. Dash and Berger were released, put on a plane, and delivered to the American occupation zone in Germany. The homecoming was cold. No one greeted them. No one thanked them. The German press called them cowards and collaborators. Berger settled in Essen, where he lived quietly until his death in 1975. Dash, bitter and lonely, tried for decades to clear his name. He wrote a memoir titled 8 Spies Against America, insisting he had acted to prevent bloodshed, not to betray his comrades. But neither Germany nor America wanted to listen. He died in 1992 at 89 in the city of Ludwigshafen, almost completely forgotten. One man, however, was remembered. John Cullen, the young Coast Guardsman who had stumbled upon the landing party that foggy night, became a national hero. He received the Legion of Merit, one of the few enlisted men to earn it during the war. His actions led directly to the creation of the Coast Guard Beach Patrol, a force that would guard thousands of miles of US coastline for the rest of the conflict. Cullen lived to see old age, often asked to retell the night he met the Germans on the beach. Each time, he would shake his head and say, "I just did my duty." In 1982, 4 decades after the executions, a small ceremony was held at Blue Plains. The wooden boards that marked the saboteurs' graves were replaced with simple granite markers, 6 stones engraved only with numbers. No names, no flags, no visitors. By then, the world had moved on. But beneath those stones lay the final proof of how a single night's decision, a moment of conscience, could change the course of war.